Thank you all for being here. It's kind of interesting being here doing this talk because if you've seen any of my previous presentations in the past, they have very much been about other people's mistakes. Such as that time when we tracked down a hacker in Nigeria that had broken into a client. We were able to find, through the mistake of his own, his name, phone number, photos of him on Facebook and stuff like that. The year after that, it was about remote control vibrators, how a company had made some terrible mistakes developing those, and very embarrassing stuff. Really, in this case, the presentation is much more about mistakes that I actually have made, and what that has actually taught me about teaching people how to hack. I have made mistakes, and often I'll panic about it. But not as much as they did. And you're laughing now, but actually I'll tell you, you start by laughing, but they did the right thing in this case. So, basically, the story, especially around adversary, actually started because of that whole incident. You know, the whole thing happened, went down, and as sort of the initial panic sort of faded out, they were like, okay, well, what went wrong, right? And it was a coding mistake. So any rational person would say, okay, how do we stop that? How do we make sure that that does not happen again in the future? So they came to us and were like, okay, we need to make sure that our developers know how to avoid these mistakes. And some mistakes happened. We promised to teach them, and I had just started at that point at Syndis, a month or two in, and Teddy came to my desk and was like, we need to do something so we can teach these people. And it landed on my desk, and I was like, okay, I can do this, but I don't want to do slides. And it was like, okay, as long as it gets done. And effectively, what we created at that point was what we, I guess, now call a happy mistake because it turned into adversary. And I see a lot of people out here in the audience that have actually gone through this, and I'm very happy to see you actually willing to show up. Hopefully, it didn't scare you off. So it's one of those happy little mistakes that, in retrospect, I think at one point it's been like this for a number of times, but it actually turned into a little bit of a masterpiece. But it has its issues along the way, and then things that we had to really learn through. Kind of, not always pleasant. But let's start off with the most embarrassing thing. Well, takeaways. Let's not start off with that. First thing that you sort of have to ask yourself when it comes to actually learning about security is how the bleep do you learn? It's not really an easy question, actually. Certainly the answers are not necessarily obvious, I think, for many people. My first mistake being Danish. Went to a high school in Nyborg, tiny little town. And I did shitty in school, like flat out. It was about 3 months before final exams in high school. And I was like, I'm out of here. I'd gotten to know a lot of people at CCP at the time, and I was offered an internship. So literally weeks before my final exams, I just packed and went to Iceland, right? It was a 3-month internship. It could have been, that could have been it, but I was lucky enough that I got to stay on, started in quality assurance, and got the opportunity to go into security in a new team that was created. So that was, a mistake that actually, again, happy little accident, not a mistake. But you can only really define that in post. One of the things that really went terribly wrong was that through my ADHD, as it turns out now, having actually thought through this and teaching others, right, actually having taught at Reykjavik University and stuff, you kind of realize how people learn. And it's like, there's a bunch of developers here. How do you learn a new framework? You probably keep typing. When your compiler is happy and when IntelliSense pops up and it's all green and you select the right functions, you learn doing that a couple of times, right? You're not going to read documentation and it's going to stick in your brain and you type perfect code the first time. No, it's trial and error. You're literally a monkey, but so am I, right? If you've looked a little bit at even sort of theoretical learning theory, which is kind of a funny way of putting things, you'll know that generally the best way to learn is to A, teach other people, and the other one is doing. And what really went wrong in my case is that school just really sucked for me because I never understood why, and I couldn't apply it, right? So math was one of the difficult ones because, yeah, you're learning calculus, but why are you doing it? You cannot apply it to a real problem, right? Your validation that you get is from a teacher eventually, but in the process of learning, you're not really getting validation. So the whole why and how and actually doing is extremely important. And I think that for developers, right, programming is extremely applied. That's a thing that really is important. So you can read all the books you want, you can watch the YouTube videos. It doesn't really, at least in my experience and what I've seen, it doesn't really work that well. I think a lot of people are like this, certainly developers. And I think if we look to Boeing, that's probably one of the best examples, they tried so hard to avoid having to teach people through simulators for the 737 MAX that it literally crashed and burned. People have lost their jobs. So where do you learn? Again, Boeing. They taught on iPads. iPads have cost lives. Okay, that's maybe a little bit extreme. Where the people should have learned is in the simulator, right? It's no different for developers, right? The best way to learn is actually doing in a real environment. You can try to teach people to hack sort of in a sort of a very fake environment, or maybe it's even just like next kind of steps, where you maybe copy paste something that it sort of shows you, but that doesn't really teach you. So simulators, yes, we like those. Hands-on, practical, you get immediate validation, or you immediately see what doesn't work. It's a trial and error process. Hopefully you don't crash in a simulator. That would be bad. Another thing that sort of we have seen a lot, and sort of the initial way that adversary came to be was the whole concept of PowerPoint sucks, right? And there's actually, this slide here is subtly kind of, there's actually 2 points to it. One is that PowerPoints really do suck. Case in point, I'm talking to you with PowerPoint. Doesn't work. But what actually is the reason why I put daydreaming up there, A, you're going to be sleeping through PowerPoint slides. B, ironically, one of the best ways that I've seen that people actually do get engaged and do learn is by sort of a subtle twist on daydreaming is actually pretending or putting themselves in the shoes of the hacker, right? It's sort of a daydreaming state where you're really channeling that energy and that mindset, right? And I think if you've ever tried to like gain confidence, right? They like fake it till you make it, right? Whether it's daydreaming, pretending to be something, you have to sort of put yourself into that position to actually learn. So while PowerPoints suck, there's actually an aspect to it that actually works, which is the whole putting yourself in the shoes or pretending to be something, right? So that's actually a subtly very powerful thing. Now the question is, what do you learn? You can't learn security. In fact, I would say that if you really do set out to learn that, you're going to fail spectacularly. I actually kind of believe that the best security people that you certainly will see in the future are developers. I think that people like me that have security in that title, I hope will go away. Because the best people that will fix code, find the flaws, are the developers working on it. The fact that people like me exist is a symptom of the problem that's not going to work in the long term. Right? I think if you ever looked at hiring security consultants, stupid expensive. There's very few of them. And they don't last a very long time. They get burned out. So developers are really the key to actually getting security, even on a small scale, right. The problem we run into is that we go and say, hey, we want to teach your developers how to hack, or like this is how we tend to approach this problem. And people are like, are you teaching people how to break into houses and steal candy from kids and all kinds of just unsavory stuff? Because people think it's black magic, right? If you see on TV, it's like, enhance, and people think it really is a black art. But honestly, it's not, right? These are very basic things, like I can point mistakes out, right? And it's much harder to be a critic than it is to actually do stuff. Most of the stuff that you learn about security is stuff that really is just basic, engineering principles and just knowing very basic patterns. If you look at a lot of people in sort of the bug bounty community, for instance, a lot of them really admit openly, like, they have no right doing this stuff, right? It's so basic stuff, but the fact that they know how the trick is done, they make it look like magic. That's a way of doing it. It's not the right way of doing things. Obviously, minimizing risk is always good, but it's all really about mindset, right? You have to put yourselves in that shoe of like, I'm going to make sure that this is done securely, because security is a non-functional requirement most of the time, right? I think it's very seldom that I've seen specifications at all, leave alone anything that talks about security. So how are you going to engineer a system that actually is going to be secure if it's not specified as a requirement, and how it's going to be secure? But also, there's people out there hacking you, and I think the biggest difference between them and you, yes, is a little bit of knowledge that they've gained through experience, right? And that comes back to learning by doing. But otherwise, they are looking at your application with a different set of lenses that is easy. Well, easy. It takes time. But looking with that set of not rose-colored lenses, but dark black, lenses on, right? Looking at an application like, how do I make it do my bidding? That is one of the things that you have to learn, right? You have to be a little bit evil, maybe a little bit masochistic, sadistic, both of them maybe. And really, offense is the best defense. You have to validate. Especially, like, one of my favorite examples is in .NET. Microsoft has made some interesting sort of changes recently, and how they interact with a database with different frameworks. And there is only very small changes that are not obvious to developers that can either make a piece of code insecure or secure. Like we did a pop quiz at the office, and when I've done training a couple of times now, like 2 pieces of code, they look functionally equivalent. One is secure, one is not. So you have to validate. You have to make sure that you understand what a system is doing to be able to validate that it is secure. You cannot trust what's going on underneath the hood. You have to understand it and validate. And what we actually find when we do go out and teach people is that it's actually simple. They're like, wait, is it actually this simple? Right? It looked like black magic, but quite the opposite. It's really not. It ends up being quite simple, which I think is a bit of an eye-opener for a lot of people. So that's a key thing. Like, just get started. Like, it's quite easy to learn eventually. Failure. Right? I started out talking about failure. I'm going to get some water before my thing fails. And we can watch this on repeat. I think it's a good time. If anything, I think he recovers quite gracefully, which I think, well, I would hope that most people end up doing. When you when you fall off the treadmill, you need to get back up. And one of the problems with failure is that people don't like talking about it. But the reality is that if you're programming, you're failing probably quite often, whether it's your unit tests, it's somebody like me finding a mistake in your code. Maybe you catch it before somebody else does. Maybe somebody catches it in a pull request or during peer review. And this was one thing that kind of shocked me when I did a presentation some months ago, mentioning peer review and pull requests and stuff like that. I was surprised with how many people I talked to was like, we don't do peer review. Okay, so if you're not going to catch your security flaws yourself, and nobody else in the organization is reviewing every single piece of code, that's going to go into production, well, you're pretty screwed. So one way to learn is to fail over and over again, right? If you've ever gone skiing, at least what I was, when I learned skiing, I was told this, that if you're not falling, you're not learning. The key is you need to fall gracefully, right? You need to fail in a graceful way that does not literally make the company go out of business. Hopefully somebody else internally will catch the mistake before somebody outside does. And that's where code review, pull requests, whatever you want to call it, right? Some sort of peer review process becomes really critical. I think it's a little bit like the immune system, right? You have a lot of what you call T cells in the body. And they've sort of learned over time through exposure to things, just like I have learned through exposure to a lot of code and found mistakes. I can very easily, seek out where mistakes generally are and spot them instantly. You need to go through that process. So doing that, through the feedback loop of somebody hacking you is not safe. Right? But sadly, that seems to be how a lot of people work. Failure also looks bad publicly, right? You have companies now taking more and more responsibility for what happens, but then they do stuff like this, like the CEO of Equifax saying, oh, the reason why we got hacked was literally down to one guy not patching, right? And it sounds reasonable at first sight. But then you're thinking about, okay, if you apply the idea that you cannot rely on a single person to find mistakes, right? There has to be redundancy in ensuring that if one person doesn't catch an issue, somebody else will. Then you're gonna end up stuff like this, where Equifax is still around, but holy Moses, talk about a fail. And you have to avoid a situation where you cannot let people be shamed by it, right? The second that shaming happens, you have destroyed culture, right? I think quite the opposite. If you make a mistake, you should be celebrated, especially if you teach everybody else what mistake you made. I think it shows courage, and everybody will learn from it, right? Again, the applied and practical examples of failure, I think, is what people learn from, especially on a corporate level, where it's like, we don't want to be the next Equifax, right? Apply that to individual level. People need to really just embrace the process of failing, right? I think maybe there should be a weekly thing like, how have you failed this week? And what can we learn from it? Now, this was also meant to be a lot more about, so it's easy to say how you learn in principle, right? It's like, okay, what do you learn? How do you learn? That's a fairy tale, frankly, right? It's not that simple. There's a lot of things that we've seen go wrong. One is you're trying to climb the security mountain too quickly, right? So we go from a paradigm where you have your yearly, for whatever reason, whether it's compliance reason, you have your yearly, presentation that somebody from the outside delivers. Everybody is sleeping for a whole day in front of PowerPoint, right? They are trying to climb that thing in a day. They're never going to get up. You need to make sure that it's a paced hike over time, because otherwise people will still be at the bottom, just crying. Nobody wants that. Right? It needs to be a nice gradual curve. And it can't be a one-off thing. I mean, I don't know already at this point, there's probably people that don't remember what I said about 5 minutes ago. I don't personally, so you need to have repeat exposure to it, right? You have to have, a moment of learning, couple of weeks, couple of months later, right? You need to expose yourself to it again. Like if you've ever done like Duolingo, something like that, where you'll get a couple of like language challenges, you'll fail one, it goes in the back of the queue, And literally like 2 minutes later, you're going to get the same question. I have had it far too often that I fail again, and I've literally just seen the answer. It's insane. You need to repeat, repeat, repeat until it sticks in your brain. Just like if you're learning a new framework, right? It's like, okay, I figured out how to do this in this new framework. Next day you come back, you're going to do it again. You have to go back and look at your notes. It doesn't stick right away. One of the biggest challenges that we really see is, I think, is what we call, I forget who came up, it was out near the office, the agile treadmill. It's frankly disturbing to see how many companies run project management where people are barely getting the code working until it's been released. If you're still writing code a couple of days before release, you certainly will have no time to think about security, right? Again, non-functional requirements is a big thing regarding security. If you can't even get it working, how are you going to make sure it's also secure? It doesn't work, right? There needs to be room. People need to actually be able to sleep and have dinner for multiple reasons. And my mistake soon will be that I'm going to run out of time. But luckily, we are at the end. And I think really the biggest mistakes that I certainly have done in the past, not related to security, is like going to the gym. You know, you sort of dread and you put off, like, I need to start going to the gym. And I guess it's relevant now that we've just had January. How many people have gone to the gym now in January because it's the start of the year, you know, getting started again? In the past, gone to the gym, and it's like, damn, I regret not starting earlier because this sucks and I'm sore, right? I should have started earlier. So I think really, if there's any of these takeaways, I mean, yes, do code review, you know, peer review of code and all this sort of stuff. But the biggest mistake you can make is that you only start doing training and learning about security once you end up in a situation of being publicly humiliated. Thank you.